The Trump v. United States Supreme Court case alarmed many who worried about runaway executive power. The decision argued that presidents have absolute immunity for official acts. After publication of the court's opinion, the most common hot take was that the Supreme Court had turned the President of the United States into a king that could do whatever they liked without fear of prosecution. If you stick around, I will legitimate your concerns, but also say that people who are acting all shocked and indignant in the media are being a little silly. What's important in a moment like this is to take a wide historical view of the presidency of the United States, not as a way of delegitimizing people's concerns, but as a way of understanding. I believe we can demonstrate together that this twist is part of a larger story. This decision is functionally saying the quiet part out loud. So we're going to look at the intent for the office of the president at the founding, rapid fire how it changed over time, and look at how the selection process by the political parties has altered the office of president itself. We're going to explore a blob of a term that I encountered so often in political science and history coursework on the presidency in undergrad and while getting my master's in political communication. The term is imperial presidency. First, let's learn why the president of the United States was meant to be a limited official. The Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at independent American government starting in 1781, didn't even have a chief executive. That was the level of American skepticism of executives, and specifically national executives. I found this book, The Quartet by Joseph J. Ellis, to be a pleasant read on how the American founders came to decide a full replacement of the Articles of Confederation was needed, and then the new framework, the Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was crafted through a series of debates which took place in 1787 in a courthouse in Philadelphia. I was recently able to visit and take a selfie. My imaginary producer is telling me that no one cares about my vacation photos. Fine then. To learn about the originally intended nature of the presidency, we need to look here at some of James Madison's speaker's notes that he wrote down during the constitutional debates. One delegate in particular raised some eyebrows during the debate on June 18, 1787. His bold proposal for the new United States. The U.S. would have, not a president per se, but a supreme executive authority, one person who served for life. Quote, no good executive could be established on a Republican model, aka a model without a king. He argued, quote, only the English model was good on this subject. The English model? Supreme executive authority for life? This imagined person was basically a king. The 55 delegates in Philly at this moment probably sat back in their chairs and asked, didn't we just fight a war to get rid of the king? What's this guy on about? That crazy boy was Alexander Hamilton, who went on to join George Washington's cabinet as Secretary of the Treasury, the architect of grand executive power, particularly on finances. Hamilton is also the reason Washington, D.C., where I sit right now, is the capital, but that's a story I've covered in another video. Hamilton's plan for the presidency, an energetic executive authority for life, was not popular, but at the same time, he wasn't totally alone. A man who would be Washington's vice president and later serve as America's second president, John Adams, well, he got himself into trouble when he proposed referring to George Washington as His Majesty the President, or even further, His High Mightiness, the President of the United States and protector of their liberties. This fetishization of the chief executive was not what the Constitutional Convention ended up going with. In fact, rather than a single president, there was even a discussion at the convention of having a panel of like 3 executives that would decide how to execute the laws in tandem, or maybe in like 2-against-1 constellations. All that to say, the skepticism Americans had of executive power after independence from Britain's monarch, it was real. So ultimately, the powers given the President of the United States in Article 2 of the Constitution were limited. Here's what the President could do. Enforce laws passed by Congress. Command armed forces, but not declare war. That power was with Congress. Grant pardons, of course, unless Congress was impeaching. Propose budgets, but Congress could ultimately pass or reject those budgets. Negotiate treaties, which then needed approval from the Senate. Appoint judges and ambassadors, again with the Senate's consent. The common strain here is the Congress, which had the authority, had a check, had a balance on just about everything future presidents could do. The focus of power in the Constitution was to be on the Congress, specifically the directly elected House of Representatives. Definitely not the indirectly elected Electoral College selected president. Even the president's veto power was envisioned in a limited way. The first 6 presidents only vetoed a total of 10 pieces of legislation, and that rejection was based on those presidents' belief that the laws were not constitutional, not because they had a personal opinion against the policies themselves or a political agenda to uphold. That's a development that came later. The president wasn't there to be an independent actor, but rather a presider. It's in the name, president, presider. The presider who secretarially enacts what Congress says is to be done. And even these huge checks and limits weren't enough for some people. This highly restricted president, basically the administrator of the will of Congress. We pass laws and check everything that you do, Mr. President. Well, this arrangement wasn't good enough for some. After the Constitution was drafted and signed, it went on to the 13 states for approval, and there it met with criticism from a loose group called the Anti-Federalists, who opposed the Constitution for a variety of reasons, among them the idea the president would evolve into an autocrat. The most well-known criticism of executive power of the president can be found in Cato 5, published in the New York Journal on November 22nd, 1787. And though this side of the debate ultimately lost, I think we'll find the words echo in our ears today. Quote, "Great powers of the president would lead to oppression and ruin. This frame of government differs but very immaterially from the establishment of monarchy in Great Britain. You are about to precipitate yourselves into a sea of uncertainty and adopt a system so vague. Is it because you do not believe an American can be a tyrant? You do not believe that an American can be a tyrant? You don't think a democratic people can choose a bad actor? You want to give the chief executive of the new government this much power? Are you nuts?" But these anti-federalists, with their warnings of executive power, were on the losing side of the argument. The Constitution came into effect in 1789. George Washington became the first president. The limited presider president the founders designed was not to last. It's been over 200 years, and it's really not up for debate that the American presidency has grown and grown and grown. At a minimum, the responsibilities have expanded. An administrative role that could be done out of a little White House open to visitors has become a behemoth. Even just stepping out of the White House and heading towards the executive office building right next door, as I did when I visited the West Wing and shot this shaky footage outside, well, this shaky footage can serve as physical evidence that the presidency, well, it got huge. Buildings and agencies everywhere, all over DC. So here's a rapid rundown of how that went down. Though presidents like George Washington or Thomas Jefferson were known quantities and had popular appeal, in general, the presidency was designed to be somewhat disconnected from the people. Individual states would run their elections and send electors of the Electoral College, basically a suite of connected elites, to choose the president. This created a gap between democracy and power, and in that space was the imagined wisdom and prudence of the elite statesmen. Of course, participation in this limited democracy, the act of voting for the president through electors, well, that was limited even further to land-owning white men. That began to change when a perceived hero of the War of 1812, General Andrew Jackson, won his election. In this period, the limits on voting for white men were diminishing. More white men, landowning or not, were voting, and the era of Jacksonian democracy began. Jackson had a new vision for the presidency, not a distant statesman blindly observing Congress, but a leader close to the people. Jackson's role, he thought the president's role, was to connect with individual men, connect them to the office of the president, to see that their will was represented through the presidency. For that to happen, the office of the president had to expand. It started in small ways. President Jackson's first big breaking of norms was his veto of the Maysville Road project in 1830. Details of the Maysville Road aren't important, but Jackson saw the project as unconstitutional. So theoretically, his veto would be like other presidential vetoes. But Jackson's opponents didn't see it that way. They saw a tyrant on the way. One of Jackson's great rivals, Henry Clay, wrote, "We are all shocked and mortified by the rejection of the Maysville Road. We shall be contending a principle which wears a monarchical aspect." Former President John Quincy Adams said, "The overseer ascendancy is complete." Very Palpatine of him. Jackson started with Maysville Road and went on to veto 11 more bills, 4 of them within a week. The way we understand the president's veto power today comes directly from Andrew Jackson. He wrote, quote, "The Congress, the executive, and the court must each for itself be guided by its own opinion of the Constitution." So he's saying, I'm not just a passive recipient of congressional will, I'm the president. I have agency. It was an innovation. None of this is shocking to us today because we're accustomed to it. A president with no opinions of their own would be bizarre. It would be weird to us. What is normal to us, however, was novel to them. The president exerting extra influence and being up on a soapbox was seen as tyrannical to his rivals. And so Jackson's opponents would even come to frame him as King Jackson, and they would call themselves the Whigs, a callback to the early British Whig Party, which wanted limits on monarchy. King Jackson went further. He fought and vetoed a recharter of the Second National Bank, and he refused to enforce an 1832 Supreme Court ruling. He's often misquoted here as saying Justice Marshall has made his decision, now let him enforce it. His real quote, ignoring that Supreme Court decision, isn't much better. He called the opinion stillborn. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Jackson threatened the use of force against a state of the Union. In 1828, Congress passed a new tariff on exports to Britain. It was hurting South Carolina's cotton industry, so South Carolina pushed to nullify, basically cancel, the federal law in South Carolina. The implications are clear. If South Carolina could ignore this federal law, states could just start cherry-picking federal laws they liked or didn't like. In this aspect, the individual state of the Union would rise above the national government. rise above the Union itself. Now, importantly, Andrew Jackson did ask Congress for permission to use force if South Carolina didn't come to heel. He wrote a lengthy letter to South Carolina, quote, "You cannot succeed. The laws of the United States must be executed. Disunion by armed force is treason. Are you ready to incur its guilt?" Threatening use of national forces to execute federal law wasn't totally unprecedented. In 1794, President Washington enforced a whiskey tax in Pennsylvania by means of military force. But Andrew Jackson set the expectation that the president could send Union troops against an entire state. The Jackson statue in Lafayette Park, right across from the White House, honors that instinct from Jackson. His quote on the statue reads, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." Consider who was watching all this go down. The nullification crisis was in 1832. In 1834, a young man would enter politics through the Illinois House of Representatives. That man's name, Abraham Lincoln. It was Abe Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln could look back at George Washington's use of force and Jackson's threatened use of force to preserve the laws of the Union. A generation later, he would follow through on that threat. He would expand the presidency once again. I still think it's accurate to call Abraham Lincoln the most consequential American president. He waged war on the Confederacy. He used force to keep the Union together and ended slavery in the rebelling South by proclamation. I recently visited the Lincoln Cottage here in Washington, D.C. This is where Lincoln wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. I was reminded how significant it all was. The idea the Union could be held together by force was not crystal clear in the U.S. Constitution. Lincoln hoisting that burden onto the presidency was an expansion of the office. In wartime, he set presidential precedents. He suspended habeas corpus, defied Congress and the Supreme Court, and effectively legislated without Congress by issuing the Emancipation Proclamation. He took several things that may have been implied presidential powers and made them explicit. That expansion through gray area creates both good faith and bad faith debate to this day. The words remain on the side of the Lincoln Memorial. Every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword. It's something that no president had to do prior, and no president has done since Lincoln. Though declaring war is the purview of Congress, the wartime powers of the executive, of the commander-in-chief, is perhaps the most recognizable way the president manifests as a king. FDR's internment of Japanese citizens through executive order during World War II is another great example. Through Daniel Immerwahr's book here, How to Hide an Empire, I recently learned that during World War II, it wasn't just Japanese, but President Roosevelt also interned Americans in Guam and Aleutians in Alaska. Wartime powers of the president get even murkier when the wars are undeclared through Congress. Truman's actions during the Korean War, a war never declared by Congress. Kennedy and LBJ brought us into Vietnam without a congressional declaration of war. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution is the closest we got. Nixon dropped hundreds of tons of bombs on Cambodia, right next to Vietnam, no declaration. Ronald Reagan's administration sold arms to Iran to funnel funds to anti-leftists in Nicaragua. George W. Bush got Congress's authorization for use of military force in 2001 and signed the Patriot Act, which have since gone on to justify wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, NSA phone tapping, low-bar warrant search of Americans, military operations in Pakistan during the Obama years, drone strikes in Yemen, the continued existence of Guantanamo Bay, an extraterritorial American military prison with indefinite detention. Things have just gotten really out of control. Now, Congress did make an attempt to rein in the war powers of the president through the War Powers Act of 1973. They even overrode President Nixon's veto of the legislation. The law basically stipulated that the president had to inform Congress if he committed American forces overseas, and then couldn't extend that activity beyond 2 months without congressional approval. But just look at that snapshot to see how far we'd come. The presiding president, imagined in 1787, an administrator of Congress's will, a pencil pusher executive. But by 1973, it's all flipped. Congress, the branch with explicit and exclusive constitutional power to declare war, was basically asking the president of the United States to just, hey, could you give us a heads up if you used armed forces around the world? Just pretty please let us know. That's totally different. You might even say that's the American presidency looking imperial. And so now's the time to touch on the so-called imperial presidency. It's a term popularized in 1973 by Arthur M. Schlesinger Jr. His book was titled, aptly, The Imperial Presidency. According to Wikipedia, yeah, you heard me. According to Wikipedia, the greatest work of intellectual altruism in human history, Schlesinger wrote, quote, the imperial presidency to address two concerns. The presidency was uncontrollable, and that it had exceeded its constitutional limits. That's a wonderful encyclopedic start, which we can now use to rabbit hole our way into wider exploration. Schlesinger posits a larger dynamic, which he argued began in the World War II era. of the president becoming front and center for war making and foreign affairs, front and center in a way that stretches the Constitution. Quote, in the last years, presidential primacy, so indispensable to the political order, has turned into presidential supremacy. He was concerned with, quote, capture by the president of the most vital national decisions, the decision to go to war. The precise case in the imperial presidency on the commander-in-chief powers of the president was compelling and became influential. But for as long as the book it is focused on war and war-making powers. To be fair to Schlesinger, he tells us in his foreword to the imperial presidency that he intentionally narrowed his focus to constitutional challenges presented by expanding, quote, war-making power of the president and ignored presidential domination in other areas. And that's where I think you and I come in, because I'd like to fill in the bigger picture of an imperial presidency with you. When the term is used today, people are not typically hyper-focused on the war powers of the president. When someone says imperial presidency, as you probably heard in coverage of the Supreme Court case on presidential immunity, they mean a presidency that is, well, big. Literally big numbers of people in the administration, big in influence, big in the hearts of the people, even a fear that the president of the United States is above the law. Describing that phenomenon takes a little less precision and a little more emotion, a little more democracy. Let me show you what I mean. So far, we've traced the presidency through the presider era of the early American Republic, and we've shown a change in the use of force a president might implement, from Washington in the Whiskey Rebellion to Jackson in the Nullification Crisis to Lincoln in the Civil War. We touched on the imperial presidency when presidents like Truman and Kennedy and LBJ and Nixon and on and on and on, when these men circumvented Congress and made foreign policy and even war without congressional declarations. But these developments are algorithmic. Is the president allowed to do it by the Constitution? Yes or no? It's time to get to the emotion of the matter. Remember Andrew Jackson's belief that he was standing for the voting white men of America against the political elites? In his mind, his actions had democratic legitimacy. He was obligated to represent rather than preside. It was the job of the president to be combative, to have his own voice, to be the people's voice. And that view of the presidency never died. It is undoubtedly the dominant view today. To the American people and the world, the president is not just the presider, not just a chairman of the executive branch following the whims of Congress. That would be foreign to us, unacceptable. The president is the face of the United States, the democratic mover of the republic, the chief executive and the head of state, a prime minister and monarch, the executive of the law and the winner of the people's hearts, infused into a single person. And that has some negative consequences, and it came about partially by design. We changed how presidents are selected. The methods by which parties nominate candidates for president have become more democratic over time, just like the country has become more democratic over time. And because of all this, we'll come to see that, we have to be honest, democracy is good. Democracy is also really complicated and messy. It causes problems. And that chaos of democracy is part of the reason why in the early history of the country, the public played no role in selecting presidential candidates. Members of Congress from various political parties met together in secret to choose their candidates for the upcoming election, and that was it. The elites met and nominated the choices that voters got to choose when they voted in the general election. Skip ahead, President Andrew Jackson was up for re-election in 1832. Because of his desire for democratic legitimacy, Jackson's running mate was selected at a national convention, the first of its kind for a major party. From that moment on, presidential candidates weren't chosen in the stuffy halls of Congress by a select few, they were chosen by a larger group of members of the party. National conventions became the norm, and major political parties nominated presidential candidates this way for the next 136 years. Backroom dealings in smoky convention halls is not most people's fantasy vision of democracy, but relative to a few members of Congress just choosing a presidential candidate in the early days, participation of hundreds or thousands of party insiders in a big old convention hall, well, that was relatively more democratic. But at the turn of the 20th century, the parties were being pushed to reform. In 1897, before entering public life, future President Woodrow Wilson was contemplating ways to rip the nomination system out of the tight control of the party establishments. He was openly hostile to the national conventions, seeing them as the process by which special interests nominated candidates with no policies derived from the popular will. And so, in his first annual message to Congress in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson proposed expansion of a developing phenomenon: presidential primaries. Quote, "I urge the prompt enactment of legislation that will provide for primary elections throughout the country, at which the voters of the several parties may choose their nominees for the presidency without the intervention of nominating conventions." Between 1912 and 1968, in any given nomination cycle, between 12 and 20 states held presidential primaries. The goal of these primaries was for voters to elect delegates to the national conventions where they would help choose the party candidate. From 1968 through today, further reforms have made presidential primaries the way in which candidates are chosen. Primary voters in all 50 states, DC, Puerto Rico, and Guam, choose presidential candidates. There is effectively a system of democratic binding popular primaries. So primary voters choose presidential candidates today. If the parties were to choose a candidate against the democratic will of the primary voters, it would be a democratic outrage. Do see James W. Caesar's 1979 work, Presidential Selection, Theory and Development, and my videos covering democracy and primaries. Caesar predicted that as the primaries democratized, we would begin to see a problem. One of the big risks of democracy is that you get populists, demagogues. Instead of more run-of-the-mill party men elevated through national conventions, primaries would bring us popular leaders who would intentionally ram wedges into societal cleavages. Presidential nominees would become better at campaigning than actually governing. This evolution in our way of selecting candidates is the fulfillment of Woodrow Wilson's dream. In fact, he wrote in his 1885 thesis that men good at campaigning, men good at speaking, oratory, should be the ones given power. It is natural that orators should be the leaders of a self-governing people. Most of us out there, I would assume, we would come to believe that campaigning and governing, these are two separate skills. They might have overlap, but they are two different things. Common sense would tell us that problems arise if, for example, someone is great at campaigning but doesn't understand the basics of governance once they're elected. Woodrow Wilson saw no such issue, and this is exactly why he called for a system of presidential primaries in 1913. He envisioned a president of the United States close to the people, one that would drive Congress to enact the people's will. The foundation of what Wilson would call the rhetorical presidency was laid by people like Andrew Jackson, who we already discussed, and Theodore Roosevelt, who claimed the presidency was a bully pulpit to push a progressive agenda. But Woodrow Wilson kicked the idea into overdrive. His conception of the presidency, for better or worse, is our conception of the presidency today. But why was Wilson so keen on giving the president democratic closeness to the people through primaries? For Wilson, it was a shame that most presidents before him were presiders. Quote, "The business of the president, occasionally great, is usually not much above routine. Most of the time it is mere administration, mere obedience of directions." Wilson called the parceling of power in the Constitution a, quote, "radical defect." He wrote in his 1913 book, New Freedom, quote, "When I say bring government back to the people, I want the people to come in and take possession of their own premises, for I hold that the government belongs to the people and that they have a right to that intimate access to it." Now, if that view of the president as being like an intimate of the people, if that sounds familiar to you, it's because Wilson's view was incredibly influential. His vision of the democratic, close to the people president of the United States is ours. Future presidents look to him for a vision they might use in their presidency. Just as an example, Richard Nixon was so taken by Woodrow Wilson that he had Woodrow Wilson's desk that he had during his presidency moved into the Oval Office for Nixon's presidency. But it's not just people we call bad presidents we don't like that fit Wilson's mold. Most 20th and 21st century presidents are way closer to Wilson's vision than they are to the founders. This is going to sound kind of creepy, but there is, to use Wilson's phrasing, intimate access, a parasocial relationship, a cult of personality that surrounds modern presidents. The personal connection people feel to Obama or Trump has no relation to what Americans might have felt with Franklin Pierce or James Monroe. And that's the emotional side of the argument. It's not just the expansion of the presidential constitutional powers, like pushing on those boundaries. It's the expansion of the feelings we have about our president, the figurehead of our democracy. We are living the consequences of the democratization of the presidency, a trend started by Andrew Jackson, advocated for and accelerated by Woodrow Wilson, epitomized by 21st century presidents. Which finally brings us back to the kernel, the question the Supreme Court's decision on presidential immunity raised. Has the presidency grown so much, has it become so supreme that it is actually above the law? I'm sure you see the risk in connecting the democratic legitimacy of the president with their behavior. If the president's view is the representation of the people's view, that purity shouldn't be stopped by another branch of government, by a procedure, by rules. To oppose the president is to oppose the people. To wave the Constitution around that little piece of paper at a president breaking the rules is to make yourself the enemy of the people. What could possibly go wrong with an attitude like that? We know the war powers of the president accelerated away from the Constitution early in the country's history, but at what point did the president become above the law? Did the Supreme Court make it happen? Did it just happen? Did it develop in the last decades? Now, to answer that, I think we need to jump back a little bit. We need to jump back to 1974 when lawmakers went to Richard Nixon in the White House and they told him he faced impeachment. He needed to get out, he needed to resign and spare the country and himself the trouble of a House vote and a trial in the Senate. Richard Nixon resigned the very next day. Now, later that year, his successor, Gerald Ford, granted Nixon a full presidential pardon, protecting him from prosecution for his actions. So, Nixon is forced out. Nixon is told by Congress to leave, and then he gets the full presidential pardon. These two items teach us one thing and leave an open question. First, in 1974, the Congress was clearly still acting as a check on the president. The mere threat of impeachment and removal caused Nixon to resign. We can see the president was not above the letter of the Constitution in that case. Congress checked him. He was out. But now the open question: was Richard Nixon above the law generally? Without Gerald Ford's presidential pardon, would Nixon have been prosecuted and held to account for his behavior in the White House? Ford's pardoning of Nixon caused us to miss a window. To borrow the Supreme Court's wording from the recent decision, we might have known earlier if Nixon had, quote, absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for actions within his conclusive and preclusive constitutional authority. We didn't learn in the 20th century, so now we have learned in the 21st. Presidency has only become more insulated from consequences since the Watergate scandal. Presidents have acted with impunity on everything from foreign affairs to love affairs. Making matters worse, Congress and political parties have weakened, meaning that powerful checks on the presidency have atrophied. It's at least felt like the President of the United States has been above the law for a while. And perhaps this is the natural course of things. Our world demands strong leadership, heads of state with presence and power. Our country, our economy, they're so intricate. Imagine a pencil pusher president today displaying no will of their own, following the whims of Congress and shirking from big moments. Perhaps in a crisis, they send a written note on constitutional concerns rather than giving speeches with a raging flame and a sense of democratic justice. Without Woodrow Wilson writing down his explicit vision of the presidency and beta testing it in his administration, we might have gotten here anyway. Wilson thought statecraft was best compared with Darwin's theory of evolution. Problematic as hell, but let's just roll with it for a second. Maybe the presidency was going to evolve given the growing scale of conflicts and economies. Schlesinger, the very man who wrote the imperial presidency as a warning to us all about the overreach of presidential power, still advocated a strong executive. The circumstances of an increasingly perilous world, as well as of an increasingly interdependent economy and society, seem to compel a large concentration of authority in the president. He's basically saying the job is too big to keep the job so very small. Let me give you my opinion for the rest of this, because even for people like me who are concerned about the growing executive power, who want to research and analyze, and some people want to whistleblow, want to try to hit the brakes on this for the sake of the republic, well, what's the true alternative that still gives us a powerful, modern, capable, and as Alexander Hamilton wrote in Federalist 70, energetic executive? The reason Abraham Lincoln's precedent-setting acts in the Civil War were disturbing to some was not because of the use of his power as president, nor in the risk of evolving the understanding of constitutional limits on the president. The risk was that he had to say the quiet part out loud to save the Union. The power of the president to arrest political opponents, wage war on citizens, suspend habeas corpus, effectively write a law ending slavery in the rebelling South without congressional involvement, those powers were always dormant, just waiting for the right circumstances to make their appearance. And thank goodness they appeared while a man like Abraham Lincoln was in the White House. Implicit powers became explicit while an honorable man was in charge. The fear of what Lincoln did is not a fear of what Lincoln would do next. It was a fear of what Lincoln's successors might do, what a less moral man might use the now loud and open explicit powers of the president to do against his enemies. Paired with the democratic legitimacy of a populist demagogue, what could a bad actor do without the restraint of an honest statesman? That is the legitimate fear people have now of the imperial presidency. We do not fear a strong executive. Most of us expect such. We do not fear a democratic, close to the people president. We wouldn't accept otherwise. We fear an imperial president who hates us, who hates our republic, a president who will take the quiet, implicit powers of the president and make them loud, explicit, expand and expand and expand until the democratic part is no longer necessary. We fear, like the Anti-Federalists, that great powers of the president would lead to oppression and ruin. We do believe that an American can be a tyrant, and the imperial president-fearing public has been jolted by a Supreme Court decision regarding presidential immunity. The majority opinion said the quiet part out loud. The president is, quote, absolutely immune from prosecution when performing official acts. The only true check on the president's power has always been the Congress elected by the people. Weak as Congress might be right now, it's nonetheless the only true check. The courts aren't going to save us. For people who weren't aware or quietly hoped all this wasn't true, it's disturbing to have it written explicitly on paper. But for the commentariat out there affecting shock and indignation at this new development, I'm sorry, you don't know your history. Here's the bottom line. Here's the quiet part out loud. The president was always the energetic, supreme executive authority Alexander Hamilton wanted at the Constitutional Convention. The presidency always, as the Anti-Federalists warned, differed immaterially from the establishment of monarchy in Great Britain. The president was always the king. Hello, it's me, your friendly neighborhood William C. Fox, and Sophie, who decided to pay us a visit. I just finished editing the video, and I have to admit that I am really tired, and I have a request to make. If you would be willing to chip in on Patreon, that would help make these videos sustainable and help buy cat food for Sophie. She'll starve otherwise, unless you go right now. Patreon.com/William C. Fox. I'm just kidding. I love my cat. I take really good care of her. Heads held high. Happy warriors. Later, y'all.